The most dangerous lies are the ones repeated so often that everyone mistakes them for the truth. Claire Bennet had heard the warning since the day the royal carriage arrived at her family's quiet village. Mothers lowered their voices when they spoke his name. Merchants crossed themselves before whispering stories about the Alpha King who ruled Blackstone with a frozen heart. Travelers claimed he had never smiled in public. Servants who once worked inside the palace insisted silence followed him like a shadow. Some even believed he had forgotten what kindness felt like long before he claimed the throne. By the time Claire stepped onto the stone road leading toward the towering castle, she wondered if every rumor could truly belong to one man. The winter wind carried snow across the mountain pass as the royal escort guided her carriage through the massive iron gates of Blackstone Palace. Tall walls of dark stone rose into the cloudy sky, their banners moving steadily above watchtowers dusted with fresh snow. Everything looked magnificent, yet strangely quiet, as though the castle itself had learned never to disturb its king. Claire gently pressed her gloved hands together, taking one slow breath before the carriage came to a stop. She had accepted this arranged marriage because it would protect her family and strengthen peace between neighboring territories. Love had never been part of the agreement. Fear, however, had traveled beside her every mile of the journey. The palace doors opened before she could gather another thought. An elderly housekeeper with silver hair and kind blue eyes greeted her with a respectful bow. "Welcome to Blackstone Palace, Lady Claire. I am Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. We have been expecting you." Claire returned the smile, grateful to hear warmth in someone's voice at last. As they walked through grand marble hallways illuminated by rows of glowing lanterns, she noticed something unexpected. Servants moved calmly rather than nervously. Guards greeted one another with quiet respect instead of fear. Fresh flowers decorated the windows despite the harsh winter outside. None of it matched the terrifying story she had been told. Mrs. Whitmore seemed to notice the questions forming behind Claire's eyes. "People enjoy frightening stories," she said gently. "They often forget that silence and cruelty are not the same thing." Claire looked toward her with quiet curiosity. "Do you believe His Majesty is misunderstood?" The older woman paused for only a moment. "I believe every person carries burdens that strangers never see." Before Claire could ask another question, the large doors leading into the royal library slowly opened. Warm firelight spread across polished wooden floors lined with towering bookshelves. Standing beside the tall windows overlooking the snowy kingdom was a man dressed in a black royal coat trimmed with silver embroidery. He stood perfectly still with one hand resting behind his back, while the other held an open document. His dark wavy hair framed a handsome, thoughtful face, and his silver eyes lifted from the page the instant Claire entered the room. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence felt surprisingly gentle instead of threatening. Nathaniel Hawthorne closed the document and stepped forward with calm confidence. There was no arrogance in his posture, only quiet discipline shaped by years of responsibility. "Lady Claire," he said, his voice low and steady, "thank you for making such a difficult journey." She had expected indifference. She had prepared herself for cold commands. Instead, she found simple courtesy. "Your Majesty," Claire replied softly, "thank you for receiving me." For a brief moment, neither moved. Snow drifted beyond the enormous windows while the fire crackled peacefully nearby. Nathaniel noticed faint traces of frost clinging to the edge of her cloak. Without calling attention to it, he nodded toward the fireplace. "Please warm yourself before anything else. The mountain road is unforgiving this time of year." It was such a small gesture that anyone else might have overlooked it. Yet Claire found herself remembering every frightening warning she had heard before arriving. None of them had mentioned a king who noticed when a guest was cold. None of them had spoken of a man whose first concern was another person's comfort. As she stepped closer to the fire, she quietly wondered whether the greatest mystery inside Blackstone Palace was not the Alpha King himself, but why the world had worked so hard to misunderstand him. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky, covering the towers of Blackstone Palace with fresh snow that sparkled beneath the first rays of sunlight. Claire slowly settled into the rhythm of palace life, expecting every quiet hallway to reveal the harsh ruler described in countless stories. Instead, she found routines built upon discipline, patience, and remarkable order. Every servant knew exactly where to be. Every guard greeted one another with calm respect. Meals were prepared without unnecessary extravagance, and every room reflected careful attention rather than excessive luxury. Nathaniel himself seemed to appear only when duty required it. He attended council meetings before sunrise, reviewed reports from every corner of the kingdom, listened to advisors without interruption, and dismissed every gathering with few carefully chosen words. To many observers, his silence looked cold. To Claire, it slowly began to resemble concentration. One afternoon, while walking through the Eastern Gallery with Mrs. Whitmore, Claire noticed several large wooden crates being quietly carried through a side entrance normally reserved for palace deliveries. The boxes were filled with blankets, flour, medicine, and warm clothing. Curious, she asked where the supplies were going. Mrs. Whitmore smiled gently, but offered no direct answer. Sometimes kindness prefers not to announce itself, she replied before changing the subject. The answer lingered in Claire's thoughts long after the conversation ended. That evening, unable to sleep, she wandered toward one of the palace balconies overlooking the lower courtyard. Snow drifted silently through the night air while lanterns cast golden circles across the stone pathways below. There, almost hidden beneath the darkness, she noticed several wagons leaving the palace gates without royal banners or ceremonial escorts. Nathaniel stood beside the final wagon wearing a plain dark winter cloak instead of his royal attire. He spoke quietly with the drivers before personally helping secure several heavy crates against the freezing wind. There were no musicians, no guards announcing his presence, and no citizens gathered to praise their king. Once the wagons departed toward distant villages, Nathaniel simply watched until their lanterns disappeared beyond the snowy hills. Claire remained perfectly still, surprised by what she had witnessed. The next morning, she joined Mrs. Whitmore in arranging flowers throughout the palace chapel. Unable to hide her curiosity any longer, Claire finally asked, "Were those supplies for families outside the capital?" Mrs. Whitmore carefully adjusted a white lily before answering. Every winter, several mountain villages struggle when the roads become difficult. His Majesty has quietly sent food, blankets, and medicine for many years. Most people never learn where the assistance comes from because he specifically asks that his name not be mentioned. Claire lowered her eyes, remembering every frightening story she had heard before arriving. None of those stories had spoken of midnight deliveries or anonymous generosity. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel invited Claire to accompany him during an inspection of the palace gardens. Although winter had covered nearly every flower bed with snow, gardeners continued tending greenhouses filled with herbs and young fruit trees prepared for spring. Nathaniel stopped beside an elderly gardener struggling to lift a heavy watering container. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, carried the container himself, and quietly thanked the man for years of faithful service. The gardener smiled with genuine affection rather than fearful obligation. As they continued walking, Claire noticed workers throughout the grounds greeting Nathaniel with sincere respect. They did not shrink away from him. They stood taller when he passed, proud to receive a simple nod or brief word of encouragement. Finally, as they reached the edge of the greenhouse, Claire gathered enough courage to ask, "May I ask you something honestly, Your Majesty?" Nathaniel looked toward her with calm attention. "Of course." She hesitated only briefly. "Why do you allow people to believe you have no compassion when your actions say something entirely different?" A faint breeze carried snowflakes between them before he answered. "Because praise cannot keep a family warm during winter, but blankets can. Reputation does not rebuild bridges, harvest crops, or comfort frightened children. If people misunderstand me while my kingdom remains safe, then I consider that an acceptable bargain." His voice never rose above a calm conversation, yet every word carried quiet conviction. Claire found herself unable to respond immediately. For the first time since entering Blackstone Palace, she realized that the silence surrounding Nathaniel Hawthorne had never been empty. It had simply been filled with countless acts of kindness that he never intended anyone to see. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that neither Claire nor Nathaniel ever spoke about, yet both gradually began to expect. Every morning the palace awoke before sunrise, its halls filled with the soft footsteps of servants preparing another day of work, while pale golden light slowly reached across the snow-covered courtyards. Claire discovered that the grand castle was far less intimidating than she had first imagined. She spent hours visiting the kitchens, helping prepare baskets of fresh bread for orphanages throughout the capital, arranging flowers inside the palace chapel, and listening to the stories of elderly servants who had watched generations of kings come and go. Again and again she heard the same surprising pattern. Whenever someone described a difficult winter, a failed harvest, or a family that had somehow survived impossible circumstances, Nathaniel's name was never mentioned directly. Instead, people spoke of mysterious wagons arriving before dawn, unexpected shipments of grain, anonymous builders repairing broken homes, and physicians appearing just when they were needed most. Claire no longer believed these were coincidences. One snowy afternoon, she walked through the western greenhouse where warm sunlight poured through enormous glass windows, transforming the cold outside into a peaceful garden filled with green vines, blooming roses, and fragrant herbs. She found Nathaniel kneeling beside a young apple tree, carefully trimming damaged branches with patient precision. For a moment, she simply watched without speaking. The image felt strangely different from the imposing ruler she had expected to meet weeks earlier. Here there was no throne, no royal court, and no ceremony. There was only a man quietly caring for something that would not bear fruit until many seasons later. Nathaniel noticed her reflection in the glass and offered a small, welcoming nod. "The gardeners tell me these trees will provide enough fruit for several villages within a few years," he said as he carefully set aside another trimmed branch. Claire smiled gently. "You seem to think about people you may never even meet." Nathaniel stood and brushed a little soil from his gloves. "A king should plant trees whose shade he may never sit beneath." His answer lingered in Claire's heart long after the conversation moved on. They spent the next hour walking slowly through the greenhouse, discussing flowers that survived harsh winters, the changing seasons, and the villages surrounding Blackstone. Nathaniel listened far more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions about Claire's childhood, her family, and the small traditions of her hometown. She realized something she had never expected. He remembered every answer. Days later, he asked whether the lavender she had once mentioned was beginning to bloom inside the greenhouse. Another time, he quietly arranged for fresh honey because she had casually mentioned missing the flavor from home. None of the gestures were grand enough to impress a crowd, yet each one carried a sincerity that could not be mistaken. Claire gradually understood that Nathaniel expressed affection through attention rather than words. One evening, they visited the palace library together while snow continued falling outside the tall windows. Nathaniel selected an old collection of kingdom maps while Claire searched through shelves filled with histories and poetry. At one point, she reached for a large volume positioned too high above her. Before she could stretch any farther, another hand carefully lifted the book down and placed it gently into hers. Their eyes met for only a brief second before Nathaniel smiled almost imperceptibly. It was not the broad smile of celebration. It was quiet, genuine, and unexpectedly warm. Claire realized she had just witnessed something very few people ever saw. She thanked him softly, and for the first time their conversation flowed naturally without hesitation. They spoke about old legends, forgotten explorers, childhood dreams, and the responsibilities that shaped every choice they made. Hours passed without either noticing the growing darkness beyond the windows. When Mrs. Whitmore finally entered to remind them that supper was waiting, she paused with a knowing smile. She had watched the distance between them slowly disappear, one thoughtful conversation at a time. As Claire returned to her room later that night, she stood beside the window overlooking the peaceful kingdom below. The stories that had once filled her with fear now seemed impossibly distant. She no longer saw a heartless alpha king hidden behind the palace walls. She saw a man who quietly carried the weight of an entire kingdom while asking for nothing in return, and without realizing when it had happened, Claire had become the first person who truly wished that someone would care for him as faithfully as he had always cared for everyone else. As winter slowly loosened its grip on Blackstone, faint signs of spring began to appear across the kingdom. Thin streams of melting snow wound through the valleys. The first birds returned to the palace gardens, and sunlight lingered a little longer each evening. With every passing day, Claire and Nathaniel found themselves sharing more moments that required no ceremony and no carefully prepared conversation. They walked together through the castle grounds before the royal court gathered each morning, inspected orchards that would soon bloom with fruit, and visited workshops where craftsmen rebuilt wagons and farming tools for villages preparing for another planting season. The people greeted them with respectful smiles, and Claire noticed that Nathaniel always stopped to listen whenever someone wished to speak. He never hurried a worried farmer, never dismissed an elderly widow, and never treated the smallest concern as unimportant. His patience impressed her far more than any display of authority ever could. One afternoon, they traveled to a nearby village where a small wooden schoolhouse had recently been completed after months of careful work. Children rushed outside carrying handmade drawings, eager to thank the royal visitors. Claire knelt beside them, admiring every colorful picture with genuine enthusiasm, while Nathaniel quietly observed from a short distance with a calm expression. When one little boy nervously handed him a drawing of the castle surrounded by flowers, Nathaniel accepted it as though it were the finest gift he had ever received. He thanked the child sincerely and promised that the picture would hang inside his study. The little boy smiled so brightly that even the village elders laughed with relief. Claire watched the exchange with growing admiration. The frightening ruler described in old rumors seemed to exist only in stories told by people who had never truly known him. During the carriage ride back to the palace, silence settled comfortably between them. It was no longer an awkward silence filled with uncertainty. Instead, it felt peaceful, like two people who no longer needed constant conversation to understand one another. As the carriage rolled gently along the forest road, Claire looked through the window at the endless pine trees before quietly asking, "Do you ever wish life had been different?" Nathaniel remained thoughtful for several moments before answering. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to make choices without considering an entire kingdom. But every path carries responsibilities. Mine simply became larger than most." Claire nodded slowly. "That must become lonely." Nathaniel looked toward the passing forest before offering a small, honest smile. "It was. Until recently." His words were simple, yet they settled gently inside Claire's heart. She lowered her eyes, unable to hide the warmth spreading across her face. Neither of them said anything more, yet neither felt the need to. When they returned to Blackstone Palace, Claire continued, joining the palace staff in preparing food baskets and organizing clothing for distant communities. Nathaniel often appeared unexpectedly to help carry heavy crates despite repeated protests from the servants that such work should not belong to a king. He always answered with the same quiet response, "A title does not make a burden lighter." One evening, after finishing another day of preparations, Claire remained in the greenhouse arranging newly blossoming white roses into ceramic vases. Nathaniel entered carrying 2 cups of warm herbal tea. Without a word, he placed one beside her before helping trim the stems with careful attention. Golden evening light filtered through the glass ceiling, surrounding them with soft reflections dancing across leaves and flowers. Claire looked toward him and realized that she no longer searched for the coldness everyone had warned her about. She searched for the kindness hidden within every thoughtful gesture because she had learned it was always there. Nathaniel noticed a loose ribbon slipping from her hair and quietly handed it back without embarrassment or hesitation. Their fingers brushed for only a brief instant before both smiled with quiet understanding. There were still no promises spoken between them, no declarations that would echo through palace halls, and no grand moments worthy of songs. Instead, something far stronger had begun to grow through countless ordinary days filled with trust, respect, shared purpose, and silent companionship. Neither of them realized that beyond the peaceful walls of Blackstone, an unusually harsh illness had already begun spreading through distant mountain villages, carrying with it a challenge that would soon test not only the strength of their kingdom, but also the depth of the bond they had quietly built together. Several days later, the first reports arrived from the northern mountain villages, carried by exhausted messengers whose horses were still covered with melting snow. A stubborn winter illness had spread through isolated communities where freezing temperatures and blocked roads made even ordinary recovery difficult. Village physicians requested additional medicine, blankets, and food before supplies disappeared completely. Nathaniel immediately gathered his council inside the royal chamber. Maps covered the large oak table as advisors discussed transportation routes, weather conditions, and the fastest way to reach families living deep within the mountains. Every available wagon inside Blackstone was assigned to relief efforts before the meeting had even ended. Claire listened quietly from the side of the room, watching Nathaniel make one careful decision after another without hesitation. His calm leadership reassured everyone around him, yet she could also see the concern hidden behind his steady expression. When the council dismissed, Claire approached him before he could leave. "I would like to join the relief teams," she said gently. Nathaniel looked at her with immediate concern. The conditions are difficult, and many physicians are already warning people to avoid unnecessary exposure. Claire held his gaze without fear. "If families are suffering, then my place is beside them. I cannot remain safely inside these walls while others need help." Nathaniel remained silent for several moments. He understood her heart well enough to know that no simple refusal would change her mind. "Then allow experienced physicians and trained volunteers to carry out the work," he answered quietly. "Your safety matters to me." Claire offered a soft smile filled with gratitude rather than defiance. Every mother comforting frightened children believes someone precious is waiting for her at home as well. Their safety matters just as much. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly before releasing a slow breath. He recognized the same quiet determination he had admired since the day she arrived at Blackstone. "If you go," he finally said, "you will not travel alone." By sunrise the following morning, a long line of wagons departed through the palace gates carrying food, medicine, warm clothing, clean water, and blankets. Claire spent the journey organizing supplies, preparing simple meals for volunteers, and encouraging anxious families traveling alongside the convoy. Nathaniel rode nearby with the royal escort, personally checking each stop along the route instead of remaining comfortably inside the palace. As they reached the first mountain village, Claire immediately joined local healers inside the community hall that had been transformed into a temporary shelter. She distributed warm soup, prepared clean bedding, read stories to restless children, and remained beside elderly residents who simply needed someone willing to listen. Hours passed without her noticing the growing exhaustion settling into her own body. Nathaniel watched from a distance whenever his duties allowed. Several times he quietly placed a warm cup of tea beside Claire while she organized supplies, yet she rarely paused long enough to finish drinking it. During one particularly busy afternoon, he approached her carrying a fresh loaf of bread. "You have been helping everyone except yourself," he said gently. Claire accepted the bread with an apologetic smile. "There are still so many people waiting." Nathaniel looked around the crowded shelter before answering. "There always will be. Compassion is strongest when it endures, not when it burns itself away in a single day." Claire nodded, promising she would rest after finishing one more task. Yet one task became another, and another after that. Long after sunset, she continued folding blankets, comforting frightened children, and assisting weary volunteers preparing places for newly arriving families. Nathaniel noticed the growing weariness in her eyes and the slower pace of her movements. As they prepared to travel toward the next village the following morning, he quietly offered her his heavier winter cloak when a cold wind swept through the valley. Claire hesitated before accepting it, wrapping the familiar fabric around her shoulders with a grateful smile. She did not notice the slight chill already beginning to settle deep within her, nor did Nathaniel realize that the quiet cough she dismissed as simple fatigue marked the beginning of a trial that neither kindness nor determination alone would be able to overcome. The following morning arrived beneath heavy gray clouds that covered the mountains in a cold, endless silence. The relief convoy continued traveling from one village to another, bringing hope wherever it stopped. Claire insisted on helping from sunrise until long after darkness settled across the valleys. She prepared warm meals, organized medicine, comforted frightened children, and sat beside elderly neighbors who simply needed someone willing to hold their hands and remind them they had not been forgotten. Every smile she received seemed to give her enough strength to continue, even as the colors slowly faded from her own face. Nathaniel noticed the change before anyone else did. Her cheerful voice had grown softer. The gentle energy that usually filled every room now seemed quieter, and several times he saw her pause to steady herself before continuing another task. During a brief stop outside a small stone chapel, he approached her with a steaming cup of herbal tea. "Please rest for a while," he said calmly. "The others can continue without you for one afternoon." Claire accepted the cup and offered the familiar smile he had come to treasure. "If I rest now, another family will have to wait." Nathaniel looked at her with growing concern. You have already done more than anyone could ask. She gently shook her head. There is always one more person who needs kindness. Before he could answer, another volunteer called for assistance, and Claire hurried away once again. As evening approached, cold rain replaced the melting snow, soaking the narrow village streets. Claire continued carrying blankets into temporary shelters despite the freezing weather. By the time the final wagon was unloaded, she had begun shivering beneath the heavy cloak Nathaniel had given her. She quietly dismissed it as simple exhaustion, but when she reached for another basket, her hands trembled enough that she nearly dropped it. Nathaniel stepped forward immediately and caught the basket before it touched the ground. His expression remained composed, yet his eyes revealed unmistakable worry. "We are returning to Blackstone tonight," he said firmly. Claire attempted to protest. "There are still supplies to organize tomorrow. Tomorrow will arrive whether you stand here or not," he replied gently. "Right now, you need care just as much as everyone you have been helping." As they prepared for the journey home, Claire took only a few steps before dizziness forced her to stop. The world around her blurred beneath the cold evening sky. Nathaniel reached her side before she could lose her balance, supporting her carefully as concern spread through every member of the relief team. Her forehead felt unusually warm despite the freezing air surrounding them. She tried to reassure everyone that she only needed a little sleep, but even speaking seemed to require effort. Nathaniel immediately ordered the fastest carriage prepared for the return to the palace. Throughout the long ride, he remained beside her, adjusting warm blankets whenever the road became rough and encouraging her to drink small amounts of water whenever she opened her eyes. Claire apologized more than once for slowing everyone down, and each time Nathaniel quietly answered, "You have carried the burdens of countless people. Allow someone else to carry yours now." By the time the towers of Blackstone Palace appeared on the horizon before dawn, Claire's fever had grown stronger. Royal physicians were already waiting at the entrance after receiving Nathaniel's urgent message. As they carefully guided Claire inside for treatment, Nathaniel remained only a single step behind, refusing to leave her side even as the palace awakened around them. Because for the first time since becoming king, the responsibility weighing most heavily upon his heart was not the kingdom itself, but the woman who had quietly become its brightest source of hope. The royal physicians worked tirelessly from sunrise until deep into the night, moving quietly through Claire's chamber with carefully prepared herbal remedies, warm compresses, and whispered conversations that Nathaniel could not completely hear. The palace, once filled with the steady rhythm of daily responsibilities, seemed to hold its breath. Servants walked more softly through the hallways. Lanterns remained lit long after midnight. Every person who had witnessed Claire's kindness during the past months silently hoped for her recovery. Nathaniel refused to leave the room. His advisors waited outside with reports requiring his signature, but each document was returned with only one instruction: handle whatever can be handled without me. For the first time since wearing the royal crown, the king, who never delayed a council meeting, placed every possible responsibility into trusted hands so he could remain beside the woman who had always placed everyone else before herself. Mrs. Whitmore entered several times carrying fresh tea and encouraging him to rest, but Nathaniel simply thanked her and remained seated beside Claire's bed. He gently replaced the cool cloth across her forehead whenever it became warm, adjusted the blankets whenever she shivered, and quietly spoke reassuring words even though she never seemed awake long enough to answer. Occasionally Claire stirred, whispering the names of children from the mountain villages or asking whether enough blankets had reached the families waiting in the shelters. Even in her illness, her thoughts remained with other people. Nathaniel lowered his head with quiet admiration. "Everyone is safe," he whispered. "You have already done more than enough. Now allow us to care for you." The hours passed slowly. Outside the tall windows, another gentle snowfall covered the palace gardens in peaceful white. Inside the room, the only sounds were the soft crackling of the fireplace and Claire's quiet breathing. One of the physicians approached Nathaniel with careful honesty. "Your Majesty, we believe the illness reached her after many days of exhaustion. Her body simply has very little strength left to fight. We have done everything we can. Now we must allow time to do the rest." Nathaniel thanked the physician with calm dignity, yet after the door closed, the silence around him felt heavier than ever before. He reached for Claire's hand, holding it gently between both of his own. It felt smaller than he remembered, and far too still. His thoughts wandered through every quiet moment they had shared together. He remembered her smiling beside the children in the village schoolhouse, laughing softly among the flowers inside the greenhouse, thanking every servant by name, and insisting that no stranger should ever feel forgotten. She had entered Blackstone carrying kindness into every room she visited, asking for nothing in return. Nathaniel realized that somewhere along those ordinary days, she had quietly become the center of his own world. His carefully guarded composure finally began to fade. He lowered his forehead beside her hand and closed his eyes. For years he had carried every burden without allowing anyone to witness his fear. Kings were expected to remain steady. Leaders were expected to remain strong. Yet strength felt meaningless while watching the person he loved lying silently before him. A single tear slipped onto his hand before another followed. There was no audience inside the room, no royal court, and no expectation that he should continue pretending nothing could reach his heart. Mrs. Whitmore quietly paused outside the half-open doorway, seeing the king weep without making a sound. She gently closed the door again, protecting the privacy of a man the kingdom had always believed incapable of such love. Nathaniel remained beside Claire throughout the long night, never releasing her hand, quietly hoping that somewhere beyond the silence surrounding them, she would hear the one truth he had never found the courage to speak aloud. The first light of dawn slipped gently through the tall windows of Claire's chamber, painting soft golden patterns across the quiet room. Outside, the last traces of winter slowly disappeared beneath the warmth of an early spring morning. Birds returned to the palace gardens, and the fountains that had stood frozen for months began flowing once again. Nathaniel remained seated beside Claire exactly where he had been throughout the long night. His eyes carried the unmistakable weariness of someone who had forgotten the meaning of sleep, yet his hand never released hers. The royal physicians entered quietly to examine her once again, speaking in hushed voices as they checked her breathing and carefully replaced the fresh herbal compress resting across her forehead. One physician paused unexpectedly before looking toward Nathaniel with cautious hope. "Your Majesty," he whispered, "her fever has begun to fall." Nathaniel looked toward Claire without allowing himself to believe the words too quickly. He had spent too many hours fearing every uncertain moment to trust hope easily. Minutes passed in complete silence until Claire's fingers moved ever so slightly within his hand. At first he wondered whether exhaustion had simply imagined the movement. Then her hand gently tightened around his. Nathaniel leaned forward immediately. "Claire," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyelashes fluttered before her eyes slowly opened to the familiar firelight and the worried face that had remained beside her through every hour of darkness. She looked around the room with quiet confusion before her gaze finally settled upon him. A faint smile appeared despite her weakness. "You are still here," she whispered. Nathaniel could not hide the relief that filled his face. "There was never anywhere else I wished to be." Tears gathered once again in his eyes, but this time they were no longer born from fear. Claire looked at him with gentle surprise. She had always known him as the calm ruler who carried every burden without complaint. Seeing such honest emotion only deepened her understanding of the man behind the crown. She slowly lifted her hand, still lacking much strength, and rested it lightly against his. "I am sorry that I worried you," she said quietly. Nathaniel gently shook his head. "You have spent every day worrying about everyone else. Allow me this one chance to worry about you." A warm silence settled between them. No grand declarations were necessary because every unspoken feeling had already revealed itself during the nights they had endured together. Mrs. Whitmore quietly entered carrying fresh flowers gathered from the greenhouse. The moment she saw Claire awake, her face brightened with grateful joy. Word spread gently through the palace. Servants smiled as they returned to their work. Gardeners paused to offer quiet prayers of thanks. Even the royal guard standing outside the chamber exchanged relieved glances that needed no words. Over the following days, Claire slowly regained her strength. Nathaniel insisted that every physician's instruction be followed without exception, and for the first time Claire accepted help without trying to return immediately to caring for others. They spent peaceful afternoons inside the greenhouse where new blossoms filled the air with gentle fragrance. Nathaniel read aloud from books while Claire rested nearby, and sometimes they simply watched sunlight dance across the flowers without speaking at all. Their silence had changed once again. It no longer carried uncertainty or hidden feelings. It carried complete understanding. As spring settled fully across Blackstone, the kingdom began healing alongside the woman whose kindness had touched every heart she met. Nathaniel looked across the blooming gardens toward Claire and quietly realized that the greatest blessing he had ever received was not the crown resting upon his head, but the simple chance to walk beside the woman who had taught him that even the strongest heart becomes stronger when it is finally willing to love openly. Months passed, and the memory of that difficult winter slowly became part of the history of Blackstone rather than its present. Spring filled the valleys with wildflowers, orchards blossomed across the hills, and the villages that had once depended upon emergency wagons now welcomed travelers with laughter instead of worry. New clinics stood where temporary shelters had once been. Stronger roads connected distant communities to the capital, allowing food and medicine to reach every family before harsh weather could isolate them again. Nathaniel insisted that every improvement belonged to the people rather than to the royal court, while Claire worked beside physicians, teachers, and volunteers to establish programs that ensured no child, no elder, and no struggling family would ever feel forgotten. Together, they transformed compassion into something lasting. The people noticed the changes long before they realized who had inspired them. Stories that once described an emotionless alpha king gradually disappeared from marketplaces and village taverns. In their place came quieter stories told by grateful families who remembered mysterious wagons arriving before dawn, anonymous gifts that appeared during difficult seasons, and a king who preferred serving his people instead of receiving praise. Many never learned that the gentle woman walking beside him had become the reason he finally allowed the world to see the kindness he had carried within his heart for so many years. Nathaniel no longer felt the need to hide every act of compassion behind silence, because Claire had shown him that allowing others to witness hope could inspire even greater kindness. Claire, in turn, discovered that accepting love never made her weaker. It simply gave her another source of strength to share with everyone around her. One peaceful evening they returned to the greenhouse where their friendship had quietly become something much deeper. The apple tree Nathaniel had carefully trimmed months earlier now carried healthy green leaves, and white roses surrounded the stone pathway where they often walked together. Claire smiled as she watched sunlight filter through the glass ceiling. "You were right," she said softly. "Some things simply need time before they bloom." Nathaniel looked at the flourishing garden before turning toward her with the same gentle smile she had first seen in the palace library. And some people spend years believing winter will last forever until someone reminds them that spring always finds its way home. They stood together in peaceful silence, knowing they had both been changed by the journey they had shared. The kingdom remembered Nathaniel as a wise alpha king who ruled with quiet strength. But those who truly knew him understood that his greatest victory had never been won upon a throne. It had been won inside his own heart. Claire was remembered not because she wore a royal title, but because she treated every stranger with the same kindness she offered the people she loved most. Long after their story became legend, parents continued telling their children that true strength was never measured by power, wealth, or fear. It was measured by compassion, humility, and the courage to love even when the world expected a hardened heart. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future stories of hope, courage, and destiny. Please press the like button. If you believe kindness is the greatest form of strength, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that love can change even the quietest heart, and leave a comment telling us which moment moved you the most or where you are watching from. Your support helps these stories continue reaching people who still believe that compassion can change the world.